history of the Hohenzollerns, kings, emperors, and the struggle for power. The story of the Hohenzollerns begins not with emperors, not with kings, but with a small, almost forgotten, noble family in medieval Europe. A family that ruled no great empire, commanded no vast armies, and yet would eventually rise to shape the destiny of Germany and Europe itself. Their name comes from a single castle, Zollern Castle, located in what is now Baden-Württemberg in modern Germany. From this fortress, the early ancestors of the Hohenzollern Dynasty slowly emerged into regional nobility during the 11th and 12th centuries. At this time, they were not powerful rulers. They were simply counts, local lords serving larger imperial structures within the fragmented Holy Roman Empire. But history often begins quietly. And in the case of the Hohenzollerns, it began with ambition. The family first appears in recorded history in the early 1100s, with figures like Count Frederick I of Zollern. He and his descendants served loyally under the Holy Roman Emperors, earning small rewards, lands, influence, and minor titles. But their true rise had not yet begun. For centuries, Europe was divided into thousands of small political entities under the loose authority of the Holy Roman Empire. Power was decentralized, and survival depended on alliances, loyalty, and strategic marriage. The Hohenzollerns understood this game early. By the 13th and 14th centuries, the family split into two major branches, the Swabian line and the Franconian line. While the Swabian branch remained relatively minor, it was the Franconian branch that would change history forever. Because this branch made one of the most important political moves in European history. In 1415, Emperor Sigismund granted Frederick VI of Hohenzollern the Margraviate of Brandenburg. This moment is the true beginning of Hohenzollern power. Brandenburg was not a wealthy land. It was sandy, politically unstable, and surrounded by powerful neighbors. But it had one thing that mattered far more than wealth. It was a prince-elector state of the Holy Roman Empire. This meant its ruler had the right to vote in the election of the emperor himself. With one decision, the Hohenzollerns went from minor nobles to kingmakers. Frederick VI became Frederick I, Elector of Brandenburg. And from this point forward, the family name would never again be small in European politics. But power is never stable in medieval Europe. Brandenburg was plagued with internal conflicts, rebellious nobles, and external pressure from neighboring powers like Poland, Denmark, and various German principalities. The early Hohenzollern rulers had to constantly fight just to maintain control. Yet instead of collapsing, they adapted. They centralized authority. They reduced the power of local nobles. They built stronger administrative systems. And slowly, step by step, they turned Brandenburg from a weak territory into a structured and disciplined state. This transformation was not sudden. It took generations. But each ruler added something to the foundation. One of the most important early figures was Frederick II, Elector of Brandenburg, known as Iron Tooth for his harsh rule and determination. He worked aggressively to restore order, often clashing with the nobility. His methods were strict but effective. By the late 15th century, the Hohenzollerns had secured Brandenburg firmly under their control. But the real turning point was still ahead, because in 1525, another opportunity emerged. one that would expand Hohenzollern influence beyond Brandenburg. This was the secularization of the Teutonic Order's territory in Prussia. At the time, the Teutonic Knights controlled a powerful monastic state along the Baltic coast. But after the Protestant Reformation began sweeping through Europe, the order began to weaken. Then came Albert of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a Hohenzollern relative. He made a historic decision. He converted the Teutonic state into the Duchy of Prussia, becoming its first duke, and crucially, a vassal to the King of Poland. This was a revolutionary moment. For the first time, the Hohenzollern influence extended beyond Brandenburg into Prussia. And although Prussia was initially subordinate, it was rich in land, resources, and military potential. This union, Brandenburg in the west and Prussia in the east, would later become the foundation of a great power. But in this era, it was still fragmented, politically complex, and vulnerable. Still, the Hohenzollerns had learned something essential. Power is not inherited fully formed. It is built slowly, strategically, and sometimes quietly. By the late 1500s, the dynasty stood at a crossroads. They had two main territories, growing administrative strength, and increasing influence in imperial politics. But Europe was entering a new age of conflict. Religious wars, political rivalries, and shifting alliances were about to reshape the continent. And the Hohenzollerns were about to enter their most transformative phase yet. A phase that would turn them from regional rulers into kings. Brandenburg, Prussia, and the birth of a military state. When the 16th century moved toward its violent climax, Europe was no longer the same world that the early Hohenzollerns had entered centuries before. The continent was burning with religious conflict. The Protestant Reformation had shattered the unity of the Catholic Church, and with it, the fragile political balance of the Holy Roman Empire. Princes, kings, and emperors were now divided not only by ambition, but by faith. And in the middle of this storm stood Brandenburg, Prussia, still not a great power, but no longer a minor one either. The Hohenzollerns had gained territory, but they had not yet gained security. Their lands were scattered, their authority was challenged internally, and externally they were surrounded by stronger and more aggressive neighbors. This was a dynasty that could easily have disappeared, but instead it transformed. And that transformation begins with one of the most important rulers in Hohenzollern history, Frederick William, known as the Great Elector. Frederick William came to power in 1640, during one of the darkest periods in European history, the final phase of the 30 Years' War. This war was not just conflict between armies. It was a catastrophe that devastated entire regions of Germany. Cities were destroyed. Villages were abandoned. Populations collapsed due to famine, disease, and endless military campaigns. Brandenburg was especially vulnerable. Armies marched through its lands repeatedly, leaving behind destruction and chaos. When Frederick William inherited the throne, he did not inherit a stable state. He inherited ruins, but he also inherited an opportunity. Because from destruction, a new kind of state could be built, if the ruler was strong enough to shape it. Frederick William understood something that many rulers of his time did not fully grasp. Survival in Europe required more than noble titles or ancient rights. It required military power. So he began a transformation that would permanently change the identity of the Hohenzollern state. he began building what would later become known as Prussia's military state system. First, he focused on one essential goal: centralization of power. In Brandenburg, Prussia, local nobles still held significant influence. They controlled taxation in many areas and resisted centralized authority. Frederick William systematically reduced their independence. He demanded taxation reforms. He strengthened the central administration. And most importantly, he built a standing army that was loyal directly to him, not to regional nobles. This was revolutionary for the time. Most European states still relied heavily on temporary armies raised during war. But Frederick William understood the constant danger required constant readiness, so he created a permanent military structure. But building an army required money, and money required control over taxation. To solve this, Frederick William made a critical political compromise with the Junkers, the powerful landed nobility of Brandenburg. He allowed them to maintain control over their estates and serfs. In return, they accepted his authority over military and taxation matters. This agreement became one of the foundations of Prussian governance. A powerful monarchy, supported by disciplined nobility, and a highly organized military system. It was not democracy. It was not equality. It was efficiency. And in 17th century Europe, efficiency meant survival. As the 30 Years' War came to an end with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Frederick William emerged not as a defeated ruler, but as a strengthened one. While many German states were weakened or devastated, Brandenburg, Prussia had survived and begun to rebuild. And more importantly, it had begun to unify its scattered territories into a more coherent state. Frederick William expanded infrastructure. He improved taxation systems. He encouraged immigration to rebuild the population, and he strengthened trade and internal communication. Slowly, Brandenburg, Prussia stopped behaving like a loose collection of territories. It began behaving like a centralized state. By the end of his reign, Frederick William had achieved something remarkable. He had laid the foundation of a future kingdom. But at the time, it was still not a kingdom. It was still officially under the Holy Roman Empire. It still lacked full sovereignty. And it still had not yet claimed the royal title that would elevate the Hohenzollerns into European high politics. But the foundation was now complete. A strong administration, a disciplined military, a centralized authority, and a ruling house determined to rise further. And now history was approaching a turning point, because Frederick William's successor would take the next step that would finally transform Brandenburg, Prussia into a kingdom. A step that would change the identity of the Hohenzollerns forever. The birth of the Kingdom of Prussia, 1701, and the rise of Frederick I. By the end of the 17th century, Brandenburg, Prussia was no longer a fragile collection of lands struggling to survive. It had become something far more dangerous to Europe's balance of power, a disciplined, centralized, and militarized state with growing influence. But despite its strength, one thing still held the Hohenzollerns back. They were still not kings. And in the rigid hierarchy of Europe, that distinction mattered more than almost anything else. Because in the world of dynasties, titles were not just symbols. They were power itself. At the center of this transformation stood a man who would change the destiny of the Hohenzollern family. Frederick III, Elector of Brandenburg. He was ambitious, highly educated, and deeply aware of the limitations placed upon him by his title. As Elector, he was one of the most important princes of the Holy Roman Empire, but he was still subordinate to the emperor. And more importantly, he was still not recognized as a sovereign king in Europe. Frederick understood something crucial. If Brandenburg Prussia was to compete with France, Austria, and other great powers, it needed royal status. Not just military strength, not just administrative control, but legitimacy in the eyes of Europe. So he began a long and careful political strategy. At the time, Europe was preparing for a massive conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession. The Holy Roman Emperor needed allies, and Frederick saw an opportunity. He negotiated support for the emperor in exchange for something extraordinary, permission to crown himself king. But there was a problem. Within the Holy Roman Empire, no new kingdom could be created inside imperial territory without imperial approval. So a compromise was made. Frederick would become king, but not of Brandenburg. Instead, he would be king in a different territory under Hohenzollern control, Prussia. This distinction was carefully designed. It allowed Frederick to gain royal status while technically preserving the structure of the empire. And so in 1701, one of the most important moments in Hohenzollern history took place. In the city of Königsberg, Frederick crowned himself Frederick I, king in Prussia. The ceremony was not just symbolic, it was political theater of the highest order. Every detail was designed to communicate legitimacy. The crown was not placed by another king or emperor. Frederick placed it on his own head. This act was deliberate. It signaled that his authority came not from tradition, but from political reality and power. From this moment onward, Prussia was no longer just a duchy. It was a kingdom. But the creation of the Kingdom of Prussia did not instantly transform it into a great power. Frederick I was more focused on prestige than military expansion. He invested heavily in court culture, architecture, and ceremonial display. He wanted Prussia to be seen as equal to the great monarchies of Europe. Palaces were built, courts were expanded, titles were multiplied. But beneath the grandeur, the real strength of Prussia, the military and administrative machine built by his father, remained intact. And it would be this foundation, not the royal ceremonies, that would determine Prussia's future rise. Frederick I's reign marked a transition period, a shift from survival to recognition, from a militarized state to a royal kingdom. But it also revealed a weakness. Prussia had become a kingdom faster than it had become a great power, and that imbalance would soon demand correction, because Europe was entering a new era, an era where kings were not judged by their crowns but by their armies, and the next ruler of the Hohenzollern Dynasty would understand this better than anyone else. A ruler who would strip away ceremony, reduce court luxury, and turn Prussia into one of the most efficient military states in European history. A ruler who would earn a very different kind of title, not just king, but soldier king. Frederick William I, the soldier king and the militarization of Prussia. When Frederick I died in 1713, he left behind a kingdom that looked impressive on the surface, but was still fragile at its core. Prussia had a crown, a court, and royal ceremonies that matched Europe's great monarchies. But beneath the golden ceremony, the state was not yet truly powerful.
It was expensive. It was ceremonial. And it was not yet feared. That would change completely with his successor.
A man who had no interest in luxury, no interest in courtly elegance, and very little interest in anything that did not directly strengthen the state. This man was Frederick William I of Prussia, and history would remember him as the soldier king. From the very beginning, Frederick William I was different. Where his father admired art, architecture, and royal display, Frederick William saw all of it as weakness. He believed that a state survived not through beauty or ceremony, but through discipline, obedience, and military strength. And so, the moment he came to power, he began dismantling the court culture his father had built. Luxury was reduced. Court officials were dismissed. Spending was cut dramatically. And every aspect of the kingdom was reorganized around one central idea. The army is the state. Frederick William I inherited an army of around 38,000 men. By the time his reign ended, that number would more than double. But the size of the army was not his only achievement. What truly changed Prussia was the way the army was organized. It became permanent. It became professional. And most importantly, it became deeply connected to the identity of the state itself. In Prussia, military service was no longer just a duty during war. It became a lifelong structure of discipline and training. Frederick William introduced strict regulations for recruitment, training, and promotion. Soldiers were drilled with extreme precision. Uniformity was enforced at every level. Discipline was absolute. Even small mistakes in drill could lead to punishment. Not because the king enjoyed cruelty, but because he believed that discipline created national survival. But to maintain such a powerful army, Frederick William needed money. And to get money, he needed control over the entire state. So he continued the centralization process begun by his ancestors. He strengthened the bureaucracy, he reduced the power of regional estates, and he created a highly organized civil service that answered directly to the crown. This system became one of the earliest forms of modern administrative government in Europe. Efficient, rigid, and extremely effective. One of his most important reforms was the integration of the younger nobility into the military structure. Instead of opposing them, Frederick William made them the backbone of his officer corps. The Junkers became military leaders. In exchange, they retained control over their land and social privileges. This created a powerful alliance. Landowners became officers. Officers became administrators. And loyalty to the king became loyalty to the state. But Frederick William I's rule was not only about structure and systems, it was also about culture and the complete reshaping of society. In Prussia, status was no longer based on luxury or court influence. It was based on service. The highest honor was not wealth, it was military rank. Even the king himself lived a simple, almost austere life compared to other European monarchs. He avoided unnecessary extravagance, he dressed simply, and he demanded the same discipline from his court and family. This transformation created a new kind of state in Europe. Prussia was no longer just a kingdom among kingdoms. It was becoming something unique, a military machine with a state attached to it. But this strict system came at a cost. Life under Frederick William I was rigid, controlled, and often harsh. There was little room for artistic expression or political freedom. Everything served one purpose: strengthening the state. And while this created immense efficiency, it also created tension within the royal family itself, especially with his son, a young prince who was intelligent, sensitive, and deeply uninterested in military discipline. That son was Frederick II, later known as Frederick the Great.
And his relationship with his father would become one of the most dramatic conflicts in European royal history. A conflict between two visions of Prussia, one built on discipline and obedience, the other destined for intellectual brilliance and expansion.
As Frederick William I's reign came to an end in 1740, he left behind a Prussia that was unrecognizable compared to the one he had inherited. It was stronger, it was more organized, and above all, it was militarized to a degree unmatched in Europe. But he also left behind a future conflict waiting to erupt, because the next ruler would not continue his strict system in the same way. He would transform it, expand it, and use it to turn Prussia into a European great power. And that ruler was about to begin one of the most legendary reigns in European history, a reign that would define the Hohenzollerns forever. Frederick the Great, war, enlightenment, and the rise of Prussia as a great power. When Frederick II ascended the throne in 1740, few in Europe expected anything extraordinary. To many observers, Prussia was still a rigid military state, strong, disciplined, but not truly on the level of Austria, France, or Britain. And its new king? A young man educated in strict military discipline, yet known privately for his interest in philosophy, music, and French culture. He seemed like a contradiction. A soldier raised in a system that demanded obedience, but a thinker who questioned almost everything about it. Yet history would soon discover something important. Contradictions often produce the most powerful leaders. And Frederick II would become known as Frederick the Great. The moment Frederick came to power, he made a decision that would change European history. He looked at the map of Europe, he looked at the rival states, and he saw opportunity. In particular, he saw weakness in the Austrian Habsburg Empire after the death of Emperor Charles VI. The new ruler of Austria was a young woman, Maria Theresa. And Frederick believed that this moment of transition was the perfect chance to expand Prussian influence. So almost immediately after taking the throne, he launched an invasion. His target was the wealthy province of Silesia. This action shocked Europe. Prussia had been known as disciplined, but cautious. Now it had become aggressive. The invasion of Silesia triggered the War of the Austrian Succession. And suddenly, Prussia was no longer a regional power. It was a major player in European conflict. Frederick himself led his armies with direct involvement. Unlike many monarchs who commanded from afar, he often positioned himself near the battlefield. He studied enemy movements, he adapted quickly, and he relied on the highly disciplined Prussian military machine that his predecessors had built. The war was long, complex, and brutal. But Prussia achieved something remarkable. It successfully held Silesia. This single region dramatically increased Prussia's wealth, population, and industrial potential. It also changed Europe's perception of the Hohenzollerns forever. Prussia was no longer emerging. It had arrived.
But Frederick's greatest challenge was still ahead, because the major European powers were not willing to accept Prussia's sudden rise. Austria, France, Russia, and Saxony formed shifting alliances against him. And this tension exploded into one of the most devastating conflicts of the 18th century. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763. At this point, Frederick faced overwhelming odds. Prussia was surrounded. Its enemies were stronger in population and resources, and at times defeat seemed inevitable. There were moments when the survival of Prussia itself was in question. Frederick's leadership changed the outcome. He relied on speed, precision, and aggressive military strategy. He moved armies rapidly across regions. He struck before enemies could fully coordinate, and he used the discipline of the Prussian army to compensate for numerical inferiority. But the war also brought extreme suffering. Battles were costly, cities were destroyed, and the Prussian population endured hardship and exhaustion. At one point, Frederick reportedly considered abdication due to the pressure and near collapse of his forces. But Prussia survived. And through a combination of diplomatic shifts, especially Russia withdrawing from the war after the death of Empress Elizabeth, the situation changed dramatically. Prussia was saved. And once again, Silesia remained under Hohenzollern control. The outcome of the 7 Years' War was extraordinary. A relatively small kingdom had survived a coalition of great powers, and not only survived, it had preserved its territorial gains. From this moment onward, Prussia was recognized as one of Europe's major powers. But Frederick the Great was not only a military leader, he was also an intellectual figure of the Enlightenment. He corresponded with philosophers, he supported arts and education, and he saw himself as a first servant of the state rather than a divine ruler. This created a unique dual identity, a warrior king on the battlefield, and an Enlightenment monarch in the court. Under Frederick, Prussia became more structured, more efficient, and more culturally engaged. Legal reforms were introduced. Religious tolerance was expanded. Agriculture and infrastructure were improved. And bureaucracy became more professionalized. The state became not just powerful, but systematically organized. By the end of Frederick's reign in 1786, Prussia was fundamentally transformed. From a fragile duchy centuries earlier to a disciplined kingdom, to now one of the great powers of Europe. But this rise carried consequences, because the balance of Europe had changed, and rival powers would not ignore Prussia's expansion forever. The foundations of future conflict were already forming, and the Hohenzollern Dynasty, now at its peak, was about to enter an even more turbulent century, a century of revolution, war, and imperial ambition. From revolution to empire, the Napoleonic Wars and the fall of Old Prussia. By the late 18th century, Europe stood at the edge of a historic rupture. The old order, monarchies, empires, aristocratic privilege, and rigid dynastic politics was beginning to crack under the pressure of new ideas. Freedom, equality, nationhood, and revolution. The French Revolution of 1789 did not just change France. It shattered the entire European balance of power. And soon every major dynasty, including the Hohenzollerns, would be forced to face a new kind of warfare. Not just armies against armies, but ideology against empire. When Frederick the Great died in 1786, Prussia was powerful but stable, but the rulers who followed him were not of the same caliber. Frederick William II and later Frederick William III inherited a strong state, but also a rapidly changing world. And they struggled to adapt, because the challenge they faced was unlike anything the Hohenzollerns had encountered before. That challenge came in the form of one man, Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon rose from the chaos of revolutionary France and transformed it into a military empire. But unlike traditional kings, Napoleon did not rely on noble lineage. He relied on merit, speed, and revolutionary warfare tactics. His armies moved faster, struck harder, and reshaped the battlefield completely. Europe's old military systems, carefully built over centuries, suddenly looked outdated. And Prussia, once the model of military efficiency, began to struggle. The turning point came in 1806. At the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt, Prussian forces faced Napoleon's army. The result was catastrophic. Prussia suffered a crushing defeat. Its military structure collapsed almost overnight. Fortresses fell, cities surrendered, and the once feared Prussian army was exposed as outdated against Napoleon's modern tactics. This defeat was more than military. It was psychological. The Hohenzollern state, built on discipline and military prestige, was humiliated. And for the first time in generations, Prussia faced the possibility of complete subjugation. Napoleon marched into Berlin. He imposed harsh terms. And Prussia was forced into deep reform under foreign pressure. It was a moment of crisis, but also transformation, because from this collapse came renewal. Prussian leaders realized something critical. The old system had failed, and survival required radical change. So they began what would become known as the Prussian Reform Movement. Led by thinkers and administrators such as Baron von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg, reforms were introduced to rebuild the state from its foundations. Serfdom began to be reduced. The army was restructured. Merit-based promotion replaced rigid aristocratic privilege in many areas, and the state was modernized for a new age of warfare. At the same time, military reformers like Gerhard von Scharnhorst and August von Gneisenau rebuilt the Prussian army. They introduced training systems based on flexibility and rapid adaptation. They studied Napoleon's tactics, and they prepared Prussia not just to recover, but to return stronger. By 1813, the moment of revenge arrived. Napoleon's power was beginning to weaken after failed campaigns in Russia, and Prussia joined a broader coalition against him. This led to the War of Liberation. Prussia fought with renewed strength. The reformed army proved far more effective than before. And for the first time in years, Napoleon's forces began to face serious resistance. The struggle reached its climax at the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, one of the largest battles in European history. Napoleon was defeated, and the old European order began to collapse. By 1815, after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo, the Congress of Vienna reshaped Europe once again. Prussia was restored. But not only restored, it was expanded. It gained new territories in the West, including parts of the Rhineland. And more importantly, it emerged as one of the leading powers in a new European balance system. But this was no longer the old Prussia of Frederick William I or Frederick the Great. This was a modernizing state, a rising industrial and administrative power, a kingdom preparing for a future beyond traditional monarchy.
Over the following decades, Prussia would continue to grow, economically, militarily, politically, and it would slowly begin to compete with Austria for dominance over the German states. This rivalry would eventually lead to one final transformation: the unification of Germany and the rise of a German empire under Hohenzollern leadership. But that is another chapter, because the story of the Hohenzollerns does not end with Napoleon. It evolves from medieval counts to electors to kings to emperors of a unified Germany in 1871, and then finally to the collapse of monarchy in the aftermath of World War I. What began at Zollern Castle ended as one of the most powerful dynastic legacies in European history. A dynasty that shaped armies, redrew borders, defined kingdoms, and helped build modern Europe itself. And even today, the legacy of the Hohenzollerns remains visible not as rulers of a throne, but as part of the long and complex history of power, ambition, and transformation.